We are obsessed with the $1 trillion club. We look at modern tech giants, companies that know what you buy, where you live, and what you fear, and we call them powerful. We call them monopolies. But this is a recency bias. It is a delusion. Imagine a corporation that didn't just hire lobbyists, but hired its own private army, one twice the size of the British military. 13, imagine a board of directors that didn't just influence tax policy, but literally owned the right to tax millions of people. A company that conquered a subcontinent, not with a flag, but with a ledger. You think you know capitalism? You haven't seen its rawest form yet. Welcome to Candid Finance History. We strip away the myths to reveal the raw economic reality of the past. London, New Year's Eve, 1600. If you were walking the streets that night, you wouldn't have seen the capital of an empire. You would have seen a backwater. England was a minor island nation, isolated and broke. Its currency was weak. Its ambitions were limited by the cold waters of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the Mughal Empire in India was responsible for nearly 25% of the world's entire GDP. They were the manufacturing hub of the globe, textiles, spices, craftsmanship. That night, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter. It was for a group of 218 merchants. This wasn't a government project. This was the birth of the Joint Stock Corporation. They didn't want land. They didn't want to convert souls to Christianity. They wanted pepper. They wanted cloves. For the first 150 years, the East India Company was actually the underdog. They were desperate. In the early 17th century, English goods were trash. The Mughals didn't want British wool. It was useless in the Indian heat. The EIC had a trade deficit problem. To buy Indian goods, they had to pay in silver and gold bullion. They believed in mercantilism, the idea that a nation's wealth is measured by how much physical gold it holds. The EIC was literally bleeding England's wealth into India. When they tried to use force, the Mughal Empire crushed them like bugs. They were forced to prostrate themselves on the floor and pay a massive fine just to stay in business. But here is where the economic incentives shifted. The company realized that trade is hard. Trade requires negotiation, extraction. Extraction is much more profitable. As the Mughal Empire began to fracture due to internal politics in the 1700s, the EIC saw an opening. They stopped being just merchants and started acting like a private military contractor. They hired local soldiers, sepoys, and trained them with European discipline. They began renting their army out to local Indian princes who were fighting each other. This was the pivot. The moment a corporation realizes that violence has a higher ROI than product innovation. Enter Robert Clive. History books might call him a conqueror. In financial terms, he was a corporate raider, a sociopath with a balance sheet. 1757, the Battle of Plassey. This wasn't a heroic victory. It was a boardroom deal gone violent. Clive didn't just outfight the Nawab of Bengal. He bought his general, Mir Jafar, an acquisition cost. But the true turning point, the moment the EIC became the trillionaire entity, was 1765, the Treaty of Allahabad. The Mughal emperor, defeated and desperate, handed over the Diwani of Bengal to the company. What is the Diwani? It's the right to collect taxes. Pause and let the absurdity of that sink in. Imagine if Apple defeated the U.S. Army, and then the president signed a document saying, okay, from now on, Apple collects all income tax in California, and they keep it. This changed the global economic order. Before this, the EIC had to bring gold from London to buy Indian textiles. They used the taxes collected from Indian peasants to buy Indian textiles, which they then sold in London for 100% profit. It was a closed loop of free money. 1. Tax the locals. 2. Use that tax money to buy the locals' goods. 3. Export the goods. 4. Pocket the difference. The outflow of gold from Britain stopped. The drain of wealth from India began. This wasn't trade anymore. It was sophisticated, bureaucratized looting. All right. When a government runs a country, there is a social contract. The government takes taxes, but it ostensibly cares if the population survives, if only to tax them again next year. A corporation has a different mandate, fiduciary duty to shareholders. In 1769, the rains failed in Bengal. A drought began. In a normal functioning state, tax relief would be granted. Grain silos would be opened. But the EIC was not a state. It was a publicly traded company on the London Stock Exchange. EIC officials famously wrote back to London, boasting that despite the drought, they had increased tax collection by 10%. They did this by hoarding rice, by forcing farmers to plant cash crops, like indigo and opium, which you can't eat, instead of rice. By 1770, the Great Bengal Famine set in. 1/3 of the population died. 10 million people. Ghosts in the ledger. While Bengal was turning into a graveyard, the EIC shareholders in London were voting themselves an increased dividend of 12.5%. This is the ultimate dark truth of financial history. The market does not price in human suffering. It only prices in quarterly earnings. The distance between the boardroom in London and the rice paddies of Bengal created a moral vacuum. But here is the irony of unchecked greed. It eats itself. The company employees in India, the nabobs, became obscenely rich. They engaged in insider trading, private side deals, and embezzlement. They returned to England with so much money they started buying seats in Parliament. But the company itself, the entity, was going broke. Why? Because the cost of maintaining a massive standing army and the rampant corruption of its own employees was draining the treasury. By 1773, the world's most powerful company was insolvent. They went to the British government and said 3 words that we heard in 2008, too big to fail. If the EIC collapsed, it would take the entire British banking system with it. So the government passed the Regulating Act of 1773. They bailed out the company. And how did they pay for it? They gave the EIC a monopoly on tea sales to America to help them clear their inventory. Does that sound familiar? That tea ended up in the Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about tax. It was a protest against corporate cronyism. The East India Company was eventually dissolved in 1874, absorbed by the British Crown. But its DNA is alive and well. Look at the modern world. We see corporations with GDPs larger than mid-sized nations. We see companies that hold the digital diwani, taxing every transaction that happens on their app stores. We see supply chains that obscure the human cost of the products we buy. Just like the distance between London and Bengal obscured the famine. The EIC was the prototype. Natural endpoint of capitalism isn't competition, it's monopoly. And eventually, the monopoly tries to become the state. History books tell you the East India Company traded spices. The reality is they traded in sovereignty. We study them not to memorize dates, but to recognize the warning signs. The few feast, and the many pay the bill. The past isn't just a story, it's a blueprint. If you want to understand the future, subscribe to Candid Finance History.